All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And I'm making my way through Murach's Android Programming 2nd Edition by Joel Murach. I've already gone through part 1 of the book, which was kind of an intro to Android, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I'm just about finished with part 2 of the book. Part 2 of the book is on more Android skills and a little bit more advanced stuff. I'm in Chapter 9 right now, which are on fragments. As mentioned in the previous chapter, fragments were introduced in Android version 3.0 API 11. So they're used basically on, everybody's should have at least version 3.0. And typically they're used to create user interfaces that work well on both small and large screens. For example, fragments can be used to let you create a user interface that works well on a small screen like a phone, while also taking advantage of the extra real estate on a tablet. All right. Now, a fragment is defined on page 260 as being a class that you can use to define part of a user interface. Then you can use an activity to display one or more fragments. Most of us, when we look at activity, we think of it as being a screen, but it is possible to have the same, to have more than one activity on the same screen. Now, if you've got a small screen, an activity typically displays just a single fragment, which is known as a single pane layout. All right? And that's really kind of the examples that you see right here. All right, there's a tip calculator fragment, and there is a settings activity that displays a setting fragment. Okay? But on a large screen, you might want to set it up so it looks like this. This is an activity that displays multiple fragments, also known as a multi-pane layout. All right? And there it is in landscape, and there it is in portrait view. All right? Now, again, it's kind of important to remember, and I know I'm not telling you anything here you don't know, and that is the fact that, this app is under your domain. So you have to come up with saying, do I want different screens that are going to do this, or would that be too confusing? Or do I want to run it like this? All right? And do I want to run it like this so that if my user turns his or her phone, his or her tablet, that it looks like this? Or do I want to force it to look like this? As always, it depends on the type of app you're using and the experience that you decide you want the user to have. So you use a fragment to define part of the user interface for an activity. A fragment is also known as a pane. On a small screen, typically an activity will have only a single fragment, known as a single pane layout. On a larger screen, an activity can have multiple fragments, known as a multi-pane layout. Fragments can also be reused if that's necessary. So here, this is the terminology. I guess I skipped over it, okay? Now, this is an interesting slide here. This slide, which is shown on page 263 in the text, and again, also on the screen right here, goes over the lifecycle methods of a fragment. The fragment class defines methods called by the Android operating system at different points during an activity. Most of the methods are similar to the lifecycle methods for an activity. For example, on create, on pause, and on resume. The lifecycle of the activity contains the fragment effects that the lifecycle of the activity that contains the fragment affects the lifecycle of the fragment. In other words, when an Android calls a lifecycle method for an activity, it calls a similar lifecycle method for each fragment within that activity. All right? So they show you first kind of what we've been doing thus far, and that's how to use a single pane layout for small screens. And again, that's what we've been doing thus far. All right? Typically, you use this type of a layout for small screen devices like phones. Many devices have small screens, so it's typically easier to begin by creating a single pane layout. And once you have that working, you can always add additional panes to make it a multi-pane layout later on if you decide that's what you want to do. All right? So this figure is showing you how to create the layout for a fragment. The XML code for the fragment works the same as the XML code for an activity. So if you want to convert an existing layout for an activity to a fragment, you can just rename the XML file. Then you can use the graphical editor to work the layout of a fragment the same way that you can use the graphical editor to work the layout for an activity. All right. You'll notice right here they talk about methods of the fragment class. This set has options menu is set to true to indicate that the fragment has an options menu and would like to participate in populating the activity's option menu by having Android call this particular fragment's onCreateOptions menu. In general, this class works much like the class for an activity. However, there are a few differences. To start with, as we take a look here, the class for the fragment extends the fragment class, not the activity class. So we're used to extending activity or app compat activity, etc. Within the class for the fragment, the onCreate method typically initializes components of the fragment that are not related to the layout for the user interface. All right, the onCreateView method typically contains code that's used to create and initialize the layout for the fragment. In this example here, the first statement calls the inflate method. All right, we saw this before. There's the inflate method. And that returns a view object for the layout. If you need to convert an existing activity into a fragment, you can usually start by cutting the code from the activity class and just pasting it right into your fragment. As far as displaying a fragment in an activity, figure 9.5 on page 269 shows how this is done. To start with, you can create an XML file that contains the layout for the activity. After you create that, you can use the activity class to display the layout. And that's what's shown here. Figure 9.6 on pages 270 and 271 show how to create a fragment that displays preferences. The first code example that we see right here shows a fragment named settings fragment, and that inherits the preference fragment class. It's pretty much they're the same code as what we looked at for the settings fragment class in the last chapter. Once you've created a preference fragment, it's fairly simple to display it in an activity by defining a layout for the activity that uses a fragment element, and that's what's shown here. Now that's single pane, but again, sometimes you want to use multi-pane. Multi-pane layout is commonly used for devices with large screens, things like tablets that we talked about earlier. So figure 9.7 on pages 272 and 273 show how to add multiple fragments to a layout. To do that, you can add 2 or more fragment elements to a layout file. So the first code example that you see here is designed to display 2 fragments. It's designed to display 2 fragments when the screen is in landscape mode. Then we get a second example that's designed to display 2 of them when you're in portrait mode. All right. Now, when the tip calculator starts, it launches the tip calculator activity. The tip calculator activity displays the activity main layout in the layout directory. For large screens, you might want to display one of the 2 pane layouts described in the previous figure. In order to do that, it's important that you be able to detect large screens by creating a values directory that includes the smallest width parameter. It's not that different from using the equivalent of breakpoints in Bootstrap, for example. On pages 276 and 277, they talk about how you can control the soft keyboard. And these different constants that you see here, action done, I guess they're values of the IME options attribute. They control or display a done button, a next button, a previous button, a go button, and a search button. Now, if you don't want Android to display the soft keyboard when the app starts, you can delete the request focus element from the body of the edit text element. All right. If Android does not display the correct action, you can use these IME options that are shown up above to add them as necessary. A couple of other things for working with fragments. Pretty much in this chapter so far, they talked about what you'll typically need, but there are some other things that you might want to be aware of. Figure 910 on pages 278 and 279 show how to get a reference to the fragment objects. A reference to a fragment object. Once you have such a reference, all right, you can call any of its public methods, or if you couldn't get a reference, you can take appropriate action. All right? And that's what they're showing here. Finally, as far as replacing one fragment with another fragment, shown on pages 280 and 281, this example shows how to use Java code to replace the content of a container with a fragment. All right? You can notice here, and they talk about some of the methods. The begin transaction begins a transaction and returns a fragment transaction object. The replace replaces the fragment in the container with the specified ID with an instance of the specified fragment object, and the commit finishes your transaction. Now that pretty much is it. Now I do want to mention here again, I am not going to be going over, repeat, I am not going to be going over Chapter 10. In Chapter 10, Chapters 10, 11, and 12 are on this newsreader app. So I'm not going to go over threads, files, adapters, and intents. I'm not going to go over services and notifications. I'm not going to go over how to broadcast with receivers. That's pages 285 through 393. So about 100 pages of this book that I'm literally not touching. I have already done lectures on the associated PowerPoints. So I'm going to pick it back up on Chapter 13. And Chapter 13 interesting. Let's see. There we go. Chapter 13 is going to go and start talking about the task list app. Not sure how I'm going to proceed with this. I've got a task list app that's written in another language. I didn't do, but I found online that I might go over with you. But then Chapter 13 talks about how to work with SQLite databases. From there we go on to Chapter 14, which talks about how to work with tabs and custom adapters. Then Chapter 15. And Chapter 15 is working with content providers. Then we go into Chapter 16, which is on how to work with app widgets. 13, 14, 15, and 16 are all on the task list app. Then Chapter 17, which I'd like to also go over, is on how to deploy an app. Chapter 18, which is the last chapter in the book, is on how to work with locations and maps, and I don't plan on going over that at all. All right? So that's pretty much what we have to look forward to in the next series of videos. All right? I'll be back to start those shortly.